Good morning, John Tracy here for another installment of Midweek Morning Encouragement. It's really great to see you today, and I'm glad that we get the opportunity to just spend a little bit of time together in the scriptures before we move on with whatever may be on our schedules or on our plates for this particular Wednesday. I want you to listen to what the prophet Isaiah says this morning from Isaiah 25. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things. Plans formed of old, faithful and sure. That's verse number 1. And then listen to verse number 4. For you have been a stronghold to the poor, a stronghold to the needy in his distress, a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. I love that imagery that Isaiah is using there to describe God's relationship with his people, especially that phrase there at the end, a shelter from the storm. Maybe you're even familiar with that old hymn that's based on this particular verse. The Lord's our rock, in him we hide, a shelter in the time of storm. Secure, whatever ill betide, a shelter in the time of storm. I'm sure most of us have had the experience of being caught outside when all of a sudden the skies just open up and it begins to pour down rain, right? You ever experienced that? Here in Florida where I live, storms can sneak up on you in a hurry, especially in the rainy summer months like we're in right now. It literally can be, bright sunshine and blue skies one moment, and it seems like, 10 minutes later or something like, a hurricane is overhead. And so what do you typically do when you get caught in a rainstorm like that? Well, I'm sure your reaction is probably pretty similar to mine. What do? You duck and run, right? You find cover as soon as possible. Most of us do not enjoy just standing out there in the rain getting soaked to the core. We view those kinds of storms as major inconveniences that are going to affect our schedules and our comfort level. And that's why Isaiah chose to use the imagery that he did in this verse that I just read. Because the storms of life, in a very similar way, cause us to pause what we're doing and look for shelter. In fact, I think that's the very reason why God allows those kinds of storms to roll over our lives, because he knows that without storms, get this, we would never look for shelter. And the shelter that he wants us to run to in the storms of life is what? It's him. Which means whatever storms are raining down on your life today, friend, they're not inconveniences or punishments from God. They are actually the loving reminders that God wants you to find shelter in him. And if it were not for the storms that he's allowing, you and I would never know quite as fully just how great of a hiding place he really can be. And when we realize that the storms are allowed by him, by our good God, so that we'll learn to find refuge in him, then doesn't that also inform the way we should be thinking? What we should be praying and saying to God in the midst of the storms? Have you ever had a little kid that you told to do something, and instead of just doing it, they looked up at you and their first response was something like, well, why? Why do I have to do that? We've probably all experienced that if we're a parent or grandparent, teacher, even a babysitter, right? You've had that happen before. Well, why would the child's response be why? Well, it's because the child is trying to determine if the instruction that you're giving and the potential resulting outcome is really worth their obedience, right? How high are the stakes, or how great is the potential reward in exchange for my obedience? I want to make an informed decision as to whether or not I'm going to obey you right now, authority. Well, I'm not saying that there isn't ever an appropriate way to ask God why, but I am saying there's a whole lot of times where, just like the way I grew up as a kid, that why was not typically the right answer. The only appropriate answer was yes, I'll obey. I can remember plenty of times when the answer to my why question as a kid was met with because I said so. And that's because it was critical for me to understand as a young person that it's not always important that I understand what's being asked of me prior to obeying. I just need to obey and trust. And as followers of Jesus, who often find ourselves in the midst of the storms of life, sometimes God may lead us into those situations that don't make a whole lot of sense to us. Burdens that he calls us to bear, or hardships that he allows us to experience. Storms that he leads us straight into for his purposes. And isn't it true that he doesn't always tell us why? But here's the good thing. God's providential power and protection over our lives are not contingent upon our understanding. And so I just want to challenge those of you who may be listening today with restless hearts because you're in the middle of a confusing or frustrating or maybe even painful storm in your life that God has allowed. And you've been trying so hard to understand, like, why, God? Why would you allow this? Why does it have to be so hard all the time? What's the point of all this that you're allowing in my life? Listen to me. You may never understand this side of heaven. But the good news is you don't have to worry about it. As long as you're obediently standing under the umbrella of God's protection in the middle of that storm, he has literally got you covered. And just like Isaiah proclaimed of old, you will also find God to be a stronghold to the needy in his distress, and a shelter from the storm, and a shade from the heat. So stop asking why, friend, and run to him with an obedient spirit right now to find shelter in the midst of your storm. Thanks for spending these few moments with me this morning. If you'd like to receive these kinds of Wednesday devotionals from Keystone Bible Church by text message every single week, then you can receive those just by texting MME to the number that you see right now on the screen, and we'll make sure that those devotionals are sent over to you every Wednesday morning. I hope you have a great day today. I'll see you again very soon for more midweek morning encouragement. God bless.